She cooked for his family. They handed her a plate and pointed at the kitchen door. Imani Caldwell Kang was not the help. She was the wife. But inside that cold, gleaming estate above Seoul, no one seemed to care about the difference. They thought she would cry, pack her bags, disappear quietly, like they'd always planned. They didn't know she had already memorized every wall, every tunnel, every hidden passage of that house. And when armed men came through the gates that same night, it wasn't the crime boss who saved them all. It was the woman they'd sent to eat alone. Stay with me until the end. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, and by the time the last black sedan rolled through the estate gates, the courtyard stones were slick enough to kill a man if he wasn't careful about where he stepped. Imani noticed that kind of thing. She always had. She stood at the second-floor window in the dress she'd chosen 3 days ago. Deep burgundy silk, simple cut, no excess. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to survive another evening in a house that had never once felt like home. And she knew from 2 years of bruising experience that the wrong color, the wrong hemline, the wrong expression at the wrong moment could become ammunition in this family's hands before dessert was ever served. Below, she watched the guests arrive. Men in expensive coats, women draped in the kind of jewelry that doesn't announce its price. They moved with the practiced ease of people who had always had doors opened for them, who had never once stood in a hallway wondering if they were welcome in a room they legally owned half of. She exhaled and pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass. You knew what this was, she told herself. You knew before you married him. She had. That was the honest truth. And Imani Caldwell Kang had always been a woman who dealt in honest truths even when they cut. She'd known Kang Tae-jun for 4 months before she understood fully what his last name meant in certain circles. She'd known his mother for 3 years and understood in the first 15 minutes exactly the kind of woman Hye-suk was. The kind who smiled with her mouth while her eyes counted everything you were worth and found the number insulting. But she had married him anyway, because underneath the armor and the cold calculation and the empire built on shadows, Tae-jun was the first person in her life who looked at her like she was the most important fact in any room she entered. That counted for something. It had to. She turned from the window and picked up the ceramic dish on the dresser. She'd spent the better part of the afternoon in the estate kitchen making jollof rice, her grandmother's recipe, adjusted with ingredients she'd tracked down in 3 separate markets across the city. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a power move. It was just food, the kind of food that meant something to her, and she had wanted to bring something real to a table that was otherwise entirely constructed of performance. Mrs. Bay had tried to talk her out of it. The housekeeper, a small, careful woman with watchful eyes and a habit of speaking to Imani in a half-whisper as though the walls were listening, which Imani had come to understand was because the walls, in this house, actually were, had paused at the kitchen doorway and said very quietly, "Ma'am, perhaps tonight is not the night." Imani had looked at her. "When is the night, Mrs. Bay?" The older woman hadn't had an answer. She'd pressed her lips together and stepped aside. Imani carried the dish downstairs. The dining room was already full of sound when she pushed open the double doors. Laughter, the clink of crystal, conversation that had the particular high polish of people performing happiness for an audience they were also competing against. 12 guests seated around a table that could fit 20. Flower arrangements taller than some of the women. Candles burning in fixtures that cost more than the first apartment Imani had rented in Atlanta. She crossed the threshold and the sound died. Not all at once. It drained like water through a crack. A laugh cutting off here. A sentence left unfinished there. Until the room was nothing but the soft hiss of rain against the tall windows and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the corridor. Madame Kang Hye-suk sat at the far end of the table. She was 61 years old and built like a decision that had already been made. She wore gray silk and a single strand of pearls, and she looked at Imani the way a surgeon looks at a problem that should have been removed before it became complicated. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. That was the thing about Hye-suk that Imani had never been able to fully prepare herself for, the violence of the woman's composure. "There has been a misunderstanding," Hye-suk said. She gestured almost imperceptibly to a servant standing near the side wall. "Tonight is for family." Imani set the dish on the table. She kept her hand steady. "I am family. Tonight's gathering is for members of the inner circle, for those whose presence strengthens the Kang name." Hisuk's eyes moved from Amani's face to the ceramic dish and back again, her expression never changing. We did not plan for additional settings. The servant was already moving. Quietly, efficiently, the way people move when they've done a shameful thing enough times that it no longer feels shameful, she reached for the place setting that had been laid out for Amani, the one Amani had personally confirmed with the estate coordinator 2 days ago, and began to lift it from the table. Amani put her hand over the silverware. The servant froze. Every eye in the room landed on that hand. Amani was aware of all of it, the held breath, the flicker of something between amusement and discomfort on the guests' faces, the particular quality of silence that forms when people who have power are watching someone without it try to hold a line. She was also aware of the heat rising in her chest, the kind that started in the sternum and spread outward, and she knew, she had learned at considerable cost, that if she let that heat reach her face, Hyesuk would win this moment before it finished happening. She removed her hand from the silverware. Let the servant take it. Because dignity, Amani had decided a long time ago, was not about winning every single battle in front of an audience. Some battles you lost in public and won somewhere else, somewhere private, somewhere that mattered more. But she was not going to walk out of the room. She stood at the end of the table and looked at her mother-in-law with the kind of stillness that took years to develop. Taejun asked me to be here tonight. Taejun, said Hyesuk, is not here. It was Seongmin who spoke next. Taejun's uncle, Hyesuk's younger brother, a broad man with soft hands and the particular cruelty of someone who had spent a lifetime standing slightly behind power and resenting it. He didn't bother to look at Amani when he spoke. He addressed the table, the way a man addresses an audience when he wants to make sure the performance lands. She wants to eat with the family. He smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. Let her eat where the staff eats. The kitchen is comfortable enough. He lifted his chopsticks. Do not embarrass us in front of our guests. There was a beat, one single suspended beat where the room waited to see what Amani Caldwell Kang would do. She picked up her dish. She didn't slam it, didn't cry, didn't say a word that could later be distorted into evidence of instability or aggression. She simply picked up the dish of food that she had made with her own hands, turned, and walked through the swinging kitchen doors. Behind her, the conversation resumed. She could hear it, the laughter threading back in, the sound of glasses lifting, someone making a joke that earned a ripple of approval from the table, as though she had been a minor interruption, as though she had already been forgotten. The kitchen was different from the dining room in every way that mattered. The light was fluorescent and honest. The air smelled of garlic and sesame and whatever the chef had been preparing before he'd been dismissed for the evening. It was a working space, surfaces scrubbed down, pots stacked, the industrial hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. Amani set the dish on the metal counter and stood there for a long moment with her hands flat on the cold surface. She breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, deliberate. The way her mother had taught her on a back porch in Savannah. The summer Amani was 11 and had come home from school with her knuckles bloody and her pride in pieces, and her mother had sat with her in the heat and said, "Baby, there's a thing called grace under pressure, and it's not about pretending nothing hurts. It's about knowing the difference between what wounds you and what kills you." This would not kill her. She pulled out a stool and sat down at the prep counter and opened the lid of the dish. Steam rose, fragrant, warm, real. She found a spoon in the drawer to her left, and she ate alone in the kitchen of a house worth $30 million. And she did not let herself cry, because she had made herself a promise about that a long time ago, and she intended to keep it. It was Mrs. Bay who came in 20 minutes later. The housekeeper closed the door carefully behind her and stood just inside it, her hands folded in front of her. Her expression was the particular expression of someone carrying information they've held too long. "You shouldn't have to hear this," Mrs. Bay said, "but I can't keep being quiet." Amani looked up. What Mrs. Bay told her over the next 10 minutes was not one revelation, but an avalanche of them. Each one landing before the last had fully settled. The ceremonies Amani hadn't been invited to, the ones Taejun had been told she declined to attend, the messages that had never reached her, intercepted by staff operating under Hyesuk's direct instruction. The small acts of household authority Amani had attempted to exercise over the past 18 months, hiring a personal assistant, arranging for a renovation consultant, maintaining contact with her own architecture firm's local representative, all quietly dismantled. The rumors that had been circulating through the Kang family network, that Amani was mercenary, calculating, that she had married into the family for access to its fortune, that she was already in communication with lawyers about the terms of what everyone assumed would be an inevitable divorce. Amani listened to all of it without interrupting. When Mrs. Bay finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "How long?" Amani asked. "Since the first month, perhaps before." Amani set down her spoon. "And you're telling me now because tonight is different." Mrs. Bay's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "The emergency that called Mr. King away, I do not believe it was real. I think it was arranged to get him out of the house." Something went cold in Amani's stomach. Not fear, exactly. Something more specific. The particular sensation of a pattern resolving, of scattered pieces suddenly forming a shape. "Who arranged it?" Mrs. Bay said nothing, but her eyes moved briefly in the direction of the dining room. Amani stood. She wasn't sure what she intended to do. She understood in the clear-eyed way she'd always understood difficult situations that walking back into that dining room without Tae-jun was not going to accomplish anything except provide Seongmin with more material. She understood that 2 years of accumulated silence could not be undone in a single evening by one woman's fury, however righteous. She also understood that if Tae-jun had been deliberately removed from the estate tonight, the people in that dining room were not merely prejudiced, they were dangerous. And she was inside the house alone with them. She was still standing at the counter working through that calculation when the sound came. Headlights swept across the courtyard. Through the high kitchen window, Amani could see the sweep of them, the specific pale white of Tae-jun's reinforced sedan as it moved through the rain. He was back. 3 hours early. Amani's first reaction was relief. Clean, uncomplicated, physical relief, the kind that loosens the muscles you didn't realize you'd been holding rigid. Her second reaction, arriving hard on the heels of the first, was dread. Because if Mrs. Bay was right, if tonight had been deliberately arranged, then Tae-jun returning early meant the plan had failed. And when plans like that failed, the people behind them had a tendency to respond in ways that were not measured or careful. She needed to reach him before he walked through the front doors, before anyone in that dining room realized he was back, before whatever had been set in motion tonight had the chance to shift into something she couldn't control. She was already moving toward the kitchen's side exit when she heard from the corridor beyond the swinging doors the sound of her husband's voice. Low, controlled. The voice he used when something had just become very serious. "Don't touch anything. Don't call anyone. Stay exactly where you are." And then the kitchen doors swung open. Tae-jun filled the doorway. He was still in his overcoat, still wet from the rain, his hair pushed back from his forehead, and his jaw set in a line that Amani had only seen a handful of times in their marriage. The expression that meant he had already passed the point of anger and arrived somewhere quieter and more absolute. He looked at her, at the cold dish on the counter, at the spoon laid beside it. He took in the entire picture in about 3 seconds, and something moved across his face, something she didn't have a word for, something between grief and fury that seemed too large for the features of one human face to contain. And then it was gone, replaced by that controlled stillness that was more frightening than any raised voice could have been. Behind him, in the corridor, she could hear the sudden silence from the dining room, the sound of chairs scraping. Hye-suk's voice, beginning to say something and then stopping. They knew he was back. Tae-jun walked to the prep counter. He looked at the dish. He reached out and touched the ceramic lid with the flat of his palm, just rested it there for a moment. And then he picked up the entire dish. He walked back to the kitchen doors and pushed through them into the corridor. Amani followed. He walked straight into the dining room, right through the center of it, past the tall flower arrangements and the burning candles and the 12 guests who had gone statue still in their seats, past his mother at the far end who was already drawing breath to speak, past Seongmin, who had lost his smile for the first time all evening. He walked to the head of the table. His seat, the chair that faced the entire room. He set Amani's dish down directly in front of it, carefully, with both hands, as though it was something that required care. Then he pulled out the chair, and he looked back at Amani across the length of the dining room, past every face that had watched her walk out of here 40 minutes ago without saying a single word in her defense. "Sit," he said, quietly, almost gently. "Tonight, Everyone here will learn exactly who belongs in this family." The room did not move. The rain pressed against the windows, and Amani Caldwell King walked the length of that table without looking at a single face along the way. And she sat down in her husband's chair, and she laid her hands flat on the tablecloth, and she breathed. But even as Tai-jun took his place behind her, even as the silence in the room shifted from hostile to something more like frightened, Amani could see, past his shoulder, the way Seongmin's eyes had moved to his phone. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. For something she didn't yet understand. For something that had nothing to do with dinner, or family politics, or 2 years of accumulated humiliation. The evening, she understood then, with a cold, certain clarity, had not yet begun. Nobody moved. That was the thing Amani would remember later. Not the tension, not the rain, not even the particular expression on Hyesuk's face. What she would remember was the stillness. 12 people seated around a table worth more than most houses, and not one of them breathed loud enough to be heard, as though the air itself had decided to wait and see what happened next. Tai-jun stood behind Amani's chair with his hands resting on the top rail of it, and he looked at his family the way a man looks at a debt he has spent years avoiding and has finally decided to pay in full. His overcoat was still damp. There was a small cut above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there when he left. Shallow, already clotting, the kind of cut that comes from moving too fast through a dark space. Imani had noticed it the moment he walked into the kitchen and had said nothing because there had been no time, and also because she had learned that Tae-jun treated concern about his physical injuries the way some men treated questions about their finances, as an intrusion into something private. She would ask about it later, if there was a later that looked anything like what she'd been hoping this evening would be. Hyesuk was the first to speak. She set her chopsticks down beside her bowl with a precision that was itself a kind of statement, unhurried, deliberate, the gesture of a woman who had never once in her life allowed an unexpected development to make her look rattled, and she looked at her son across the length of the table. "You're back early," she said. "I am." Tae-jun pulled out the chair beside Imani's and sat, not at the head of the table, beside his wife. He reached across and lifted the lid from the ceramic dish and the smell of it. Warm spices, rice, something deep and fragrant and entirely out of place in this room, moved through the air, and several people blinked as though the smell itself was an act of aggression. The meeting was cancelled. Cancelled. Hyesuk repeated the word carefully, tasting it. Cancelled. His eyes moved from her to Seongmin and back. The contact I was supposed to meet never showed. Strange. He's a reliable man, never missed a meeting in 11 years. He picked up a clean fork from the table setting in front of him and helped himself to a portion of rice. "Do either of you know anything about that?" Seongmin leaned back in his chair. He had recovered himself by now. The smile was back, smaller than it had been but present, functioning the way a smile functions when it's being used as armor rather than an expression of anything genuine. "How would we know about your business meetings, nephew? That's your world. We stay in ours." "That's been true," Tae-jun said, "up until recently." The sentence landed in the middle of the table like something dropped from a height. Several of the guests found sudden interest in their own bowls. One of the women, a cousin by marriage, Imani had been told her name once and had not been invited to speak to her since, reached for her water glass and held it without drinking from it. Kang Min-jae seated 3 chairs down on the right side. Tae-jun's cousin, broad-shouldered, 29 years old, and carrying the particular restlessness of a young man who believed he deserved more authority than he'd been given, shifted in his seat. It was a small movement, the kind that passes unnoticed in a crowded room. Imani noticed it. She had developed over 2 years inside this family a secondary set of instincts that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with survival. She noticed Min-jae's shoulder drop slightly. She noticed the fractional turn of his head towards Seongmin. She noticed that he did not look at Tai-jun. Men who have done nothing to be ashamed of look at the person who is speaking. Men who have done something look everywhere except there. Tae-jun was still talking to his mother. "The dinner tonight. Whose idea was it?" "Mine." Hyesuk didn't hesitate. "A celebration. The Lim partnership agreement was finalized this week. It seemed appropriate to gather the family." "The Lim partnership." Tae-jun nodded slowly. "And the guest list. You made that yourself?" "Of course. And you decided what time it should begin." "Tai-jun." What time? His voice was flat, not raised. The flatness was the thing. Hyesuk pressed her lips together. 7 o'clock, as usual. And you called Park Do-yoon this afternoon to confirm the security arrangements. Silence. Do-yoon's name in the room changed the texture of the air. Park Do-yoon was Taejun's security chief, had been for 6 years, and his involvement was not a social detail. It was an operational one. Naming him at a dinner table was the same as naming the alarm system on a vault. It meant the conversation had moved somewhere that required protection. Hyesuk's composure held, but only just. Amani could see the seam of it, the slight tightening at the corners of the older woman's mouth, the way her hands, previously still in her lap, made a small involuntary adjustment. I spoke to Do-yoon about the perimeter staff for the evening. That is entirely routine. It is, Taejun agreed, except Do-yoon tells me you also asked him which route I was using to get to the Gangnam meeting. For security purposes, you said. He set down his fork. My mother has never once in 6 years asked Park Do-yoon about my travel routes. The grandfather clock in the corridor marked the half hour. Nobody reacted. Seong-min unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. You come home early and now you're interrogating your own family over a dinner. What exactly are you suggesting, Taejun? I'm not suggesting anything. Taejun looked at him directly for the first time. I'm asking questions. There's a difference. You know the difference. I know that you've been under considerable strain for months. The restructuring, the pressure from the Busan group, Seong-min paused, and his eyes moved to Amani with the particular deliberateness of a man making a point without saying it. The personal complications. It's understandable that your judgment might be, choose your next word carefully, Taejun said. Seong-min smiled. I was going to say stretched. The two men looked at each other across the table, and the thing between them was not new. Amani understood that clearly in that moment. This was not a conflict that had started tonight. This was something old, something that had been building in the architecture of this family long before she entered it, and she was only now understanding the full shape of this. She had been used as one of its components. The warmth that had briefly entered the room with Taejun's arrival began to drain. It was Do-yoon who came through the dining room doors then. He knocked once and entered without waiting for an answer. A man in his early 40s, compact, with the particular stillness of someone trained to assess a room in the first second of entering it. He caught Taejun's eye and gave one short nod. Taejun stood. Excuse me. One moment. He stepped out. The door swung shut behind him, and in his absence the room became something else entirely. Amani could feel it shift, the way weather shifts, the pressure changing in the air before anything visible happens. She kept her hands flat on the tablecloth. She looked at the dish in front of her. She did not look at Seong-min, because looking at Seong-min right now would be handing him something she wasn't willing to give. She heard his voice anyway. You should have left when it was still graceful, he said. Low, conversational, almost kind. A woman with your ambition, your education. You had options. Instead, you stayed and made everything harder for everyone. Amani lifted her water glass and drank from it, set it down. Including him, Seong-min continued. Especially him. One of the women across the table made a small, uncomfortable sound. Her husband touched her arm, and she was quiet. Amani said without looking up from the dish, Are you finished? I'm making an observation. You're making a speech. She finally looked at him, directly, without heat, without any of the things she was actually feeling behind her sternum. In front of people who are going to remember whatever you say next for a very long time. So I'd think about whether the point you're trying to make is worth the cost of making it. Seong-min's smile thinned. Min-jae, to his right, made that small shoulder movement again. The dining room doors opened and Taejun came back in. He was moving differently now. The controlled stillness was still there, but something underneath it had changed, the way the surface of water changes when there's current running beneath it. He walked to his chair and did not sit. He looked at his mother. Do-yoon ran a check on the contact I was supposed to meet tonight, he said. The man called the meeting. He confirmed it twice. Then 4 hours ago, someone accessed his contact file from inside the Kang network and canceled on his behalf. He paused. The access code used belongs to this household. Hyesuk did not look away. Access codes are used by staff, any number of people. The code is registered to your personal terminal, Mother. A complete and total silence. Then Hyesuk said, "That is not possible." Do-yoon pulled the log himself. Taejun's voice had gone entirely flat, the way a road goes flat before a cliff. "I saw it. The timestamp is 3:47 this afternoon." Hyesuk stood. She did it slowly, with the full dignity of a woman who had spent 60 years ensuring that no one ever watched her do anything quickly. "I will not sit at this table and be accused of—" "I haven't accused you of anything." Taejun's voice stopped her. Not loud, just final. "I've told you what the log shows. Those are two different things." He looked at Seong-min. "Maybe you can explain the difference." Seong-min's hand moved toward his phone on the table. Slight. Barely there. Taejun said, "Don't." Seong-min's hand stopped. "Everyone's phones," Taejun said, and raised his voice just enough to reach the entire table. On the table, face down, Do-yoon. Do-yoon stepped forward from the doorway, and the two men who had come in behind him, quiet men, stationed men, the kind who stood in the background of Taejun's world and were easy to overlook until moments exactly like this one moved to positions near the exits. There were sounds of protest, a guest asking what was happening, one of the women starting to rise and being told, politely and without room for negotiation, to remain seated. Phones placed on the tablecloth with varying degrees of compliance, some shoved down with resentment, one placed with careful deliberateness by Min Jae, who was the only person in the room besides Amani who hadn't said a single word since Taejun came back. Hyesuk looked at her son across the length of the table. Her pearls caught the candlelight. Her face was a thing constructed and maintained over decades, and it held, but Amani, watching from the chair at the head of the table, the chair that still held the slight warmth of the man who usually sat in it, could see what was happening in Hyesuk's eyes. Not guilt, not yet. Something more complicated. The look of a woman calculating rapidly, reorienting, trying to determine how much had been seen and whether anything could still be managed. "You're frightening your guests," Hyesuk said. "My guests," Taejun said, "are fine." "Taejun, whatever you think you've found, Mrs. Bae." The housekeeper appeared from the kitchen doorway. She had been there, Imani realized. Had been standing just inside it, waiting, holding something. A small stack of envelopes, cream-colored, with the Kong family crest embossed at the corner. She crossed the room without looking at anyone except Taejun and placed the envelopes on the table in front of him. He didn't touch them. He looked at his mother. Hyesuk's eyes went to the envelopes, and something in her face changed. Something minute and devastating, a hairline fracture in the construction. And she said, very quietly, "Where did you get those?" "They were in the household files," Mrs. Bae said, "in the secondary office, the room that was reassigned when Mrs. Kang—" A brief, careful pause. "The younger Mrs. Kang's administrative assistant was let go." Imani's administrative assistant. The woman she'd hired in her third month at the estate. The one who had resigned abruptly after 6 weeks citing personal reasons. The one Imani had always believed had been managed out by the household because she'd seen the way the woman's access to estate systems was restricted in her final 2 weeks. She'd said nothing about it because there had been nothing she could prove, and everything she tried to prove in this house had a way of becoming evidence of her own unreasonableness. Taejun picked up the top envelope, opened it, read. The room waited. He set it down, picked up the second one, read that too. When he looked up, his expression was the same as it had been, controlled, level, but his jaw had shifted in the way it shifted when he was managing something enormous behind the closed door of his composure. "These are letters," he said, "correspondence between this household and a private security firm." He looked at Seong-min. "A firm I know, one that's done contract work for the Busan Group." Seong-min said nothing. "The letters document surveillance." Taejun's voice was careful now, picking each word up and placing it down exactly. "Of my wife, her communications, her meetings, her architectural firm's contracts." A pause. "Her shipping documentation." Imani felt something move through her. Cold, specific, arriving with the particular clarity of a thing understood too late. The shipping documentation. 6 months ago, 3 separate project files from her firm had gone missing from the estate office. Files for a redevelopment project on the Port District, a project she'd spent 14 months designing. She had reported it to the estate administrator. She had been told the files had likely been misfiled during a server migration. She had believed it because she had needed to believe something that wasn't what it was. The documentation for the port project, Tae-jun said, still looking at Seong-min. You know what those files contain. Seong-min's face was unreadable. They contain the legal transit frameworks I've spent 3 years building, Tae-jun said. The routes that take this family out of everything we shouldn't be in and into everything we can do openly. Clean routes, legal routes. His voice hadn't risen once. Routes that, if they were handed to the right people, would give those people leverage over every legitimate move I've made in the last 36 months. Tae-jun, Hyesuk said, were you given those files? He wasn't asking his mother. He was asking Seong-min. Did you take them? Seong-min picked up his water glass, drank from it with a kind of calculated ease that was too deliberate to be genuine. I've been protecting this family for 30 years, before you were old enough to understand what protecting something costs. I did what needed to be done. Answer the question. I just did. The two men looked at each other, and Imani understood, in that moment, that what she was watching was not a confrontation between an uncle and his nephew. It was a confrontation between two men who had wanted the same thing for a very long time and had been circling each other for years, and tonight the circle had finally closed. Min-jae pushed back from the table, not dramatically, quietly, the way a man moves when he's decided something. He stood, and Do-yoon was already moving, and Min-jae said, I need some air, and Do-yoon said, sit down. And Min-jae looked at his cousin across the table with an expression that was almost apologetic and said, I'm sorry, Tae-jun. I genuinely am. Sit down, Tae-jun said. Min-jae sat, but the apology, the particular shape of it, the fact that it came now, preemptively, before any direct accusation had been leveled at him, told Imani everything about what Min-jae knew and how long he'd known it. You didn't apologize in advance unless you were aware of what you'd done. And what Min-jae was aware of, Imani was only now beginning to understand the full weight of. Hyesuk had moved around the end of the table. She was standing now between her son and her brother, and she said with a composure that cost her visibly, whatever Seong-min did, he did for the family, for the bloodline, for the future of everything your father built. He did it to take it, Tae-jun said, and you helped him. That is not the access code, mother. Hyesuk stopped. 3:47 this afternoon, Tae-jun said. Your terminal, your code. The meeting I was supposed to be at tonight, the one that would have kept me across the city until midnight. He looked at her, and Imani watched his face in that moment, and it was the hardest thing she had ever watched, because what she saw on it was not rage. Rage would have been easier. What she saw was something closer to a man watching a thing he'd always half suspected become completely real, and finding that it was exactly as terrible as he'd imagined it would be. Tell me you didn't know. Hyesuk's chin lifted a fraction. Everything I have done has been to protect this family. That's not what I asked you. She didn't answer. The candles on the table burned without flickering. The rain against the windows had intensified. Imani could hear it in the walls now, a deeper pressure, the kind of rain that doesn't intend to stop. Then every light in the estate went out. Not a flicker, not a surge, just gone. The chandelier, the wall sconces, the kitchen light visible through the swinging doors, the small lamp on the sideboard. All of it at once, the way power disappears when someone cuts it deliberately rather than when a fuse fails. Emergency lighting activated 4 seconds later, a deep red wash that turned the dining room into something that looked less like a family dinner and more like the inside of a warning. In the red light, Imani looked at Seong-min. He was the only person in the room who had not reacted to the darkness. He hadn't flinched, hadn't reached for anything, hadn't made a sound. He sat in the red-washed light with his hands folded on the table and something in his expression that she had never seen on any face in any room she'd ever been in. A particular species of patience that wasn't patience at all, but anticipation. Outside, from beyond the estate walls came a sound. Not thunder, not traffic. Something much more deliberate and much closer, moving fast through the rain-soaked dark. Taejun heard it the same moment Imani did. She watched his body change, the way a man's body changes when his training overrides everything else, and the calculations that have kept him alive for 15 years in a world that doesn't tolerate mistakes begin running faster than conscious thought. He turned to Do-yoon. Do-yoon was already on his radio, and Seong-min, in the red-washed dark, unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the tablecloth and looked at Tae. Jun, with an expression that had finally dropped every performance it had been running all evening, and what was underneath was something Imani had no name for, something ancient and hungry and entirely without regret. "You were always too slow to see it coming," he said. "That was your father's problem, too." The first gunshot cracked across the courtyard like something breaking that was never meant to hold. The second shot came 4 seconds after the first. Taejun was already moving before the echo of the first one finished crossing the courtyard. He crossed the dining room in 5 strides, grabbed Imani's arm, not rough, but with the specific grip of a man who has no time to be gentle and knows the difference between holding someone and dragging them, and pulled her behind the marble pillar nearest the far wall. The pillar was decorative. Imani had measured it once during a renovation consultation 18 months ago, and she knew it was solid Carrara marble, 40 centimeters thick. She'd noted it the way architects note structural details, the way she noted everything about this house, cataloging information she hadn't known yet that she would need. She was glad for it now. "Stay behind me," Taejun said. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her for exactly 1 second, the look of a man recalibrating what he knows about the person standing beside him, and then he turned back to the room. Do-yoon had the remaining 2 guards positioned at the dining room's 2 exits. The guests had dropped from their chairs, some to the floor, some pressed against the walls, one elderly woman in a blue dress crouching beneath the table with her hands over her ears as though the posture alone could make her disappear. The red emergency light made everyone look wounded. Seong-min had not moved from his chair. That was the detail Imani kept returning to. While everyone else in the room had responded to gunfire the way human beings respond to gunfire, with their bodies, with noise, with the fundamental animal instinct toward the floor and away from windows. Seong-min sat in his chair with the stillness of a man who already knew the shooting was happening and had already decided it had nothing to do with him. "How many?" Taejun said to Do-yoon. Do-yoon had his radio pressed to his ear. His face in the red light was unreadable. "West perimeter, at least 6, armed." A pause while he listened. They cut the generator feed and both phone landlines. "We're on backup cells. The outer gate? Breached." Taejun absorbed this without visible reaction. Imani watched him the way she'd watched him in other impossible situations. The board meetings where rival interests tried to dismantle his position, the family confrontations that went sideways in ways nobody anticipated, and she had always understood that what made him dangerous was not aggression. It was the speed with which he became very, very quiet. He was very quiet now. "Get everyone who isn't family into the east corridor," he said to Do-yoon. "The staff quarters are reinforced. Lock them in." His eyes went around the room. "Now!" Do-yoon began moving the guests. There was noise, someone crying, a man protesting, the woman in the blue dress being helped to her feet by one of the guards. In the space of 2 minutes, the room had emptied of everyone except Taejun, Imani, Do-yoon, Hye-suk, Seong-min, Min-jae, and 2 remaining guards positioned at the doors. Seong-min finally stood. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cufflinks. The gestures were obscene in their normalcy. The movements of a man preparing for a meeting, not a man sitting 20 meters from active gunfire. "You should know," he said, "that they're not here to kill you." The room went a different kind of still. Taejun looked at him. "They're here to secure the estate," Seong-min continued, "to hold it until the transfer of authority documentation can be processed. By morning, the primary accounts, the Lim partnership agreement, and the port transit frameworks will be in the hands of people who know how to use them." He looked at his nephew with something that might, in a different man, have been called sorrow. "You were supposed to be across the city. That was the only mercy I was offering you. A chance to be somewhere else when it happened." "When you stole everything I built," Taejun said, "when I reclaimed what should have been managed properly from the beginning," Seong-min's voice shifted. The performance dropped, and what came through underneath was something raw and old and deeply personal. "Your father gave you everything, the name, the network, the infrastructure I spent 15 years helping him construct. And what did you do with it? You started dismantling it. Routes we'd used for a decade, partnerships that cost blood to establish. You started pulling it all apart to build something clean. He said the word like it tasted wrong. Clean. As though the dirt on our hands was something to be ashamed of. It was, Taejun said. It was power, Sungmin said, and you threw it away because of her. His eyes moved to Amani. She didn't look away. She had stopped letting this man's gaze be something that moved her a long time ago. The port project, Sungmin said, the redevelopment, the legal shipping frameworks buried in her architectural contracts. Very elegant, nephew, using a legitimate firm as cover for the infrastructure you were building. A pause. Unfortunately, elegance requires secrecy, and your wife was not as discreet as she believed. The files were stolen, Amani said. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised by that. From a locked office inside this estate. That's not a failure of discretion. That's a violation. That's business, Seongmin said. Who did you sell them to? Taejun took one step toward his uncle, and Doyun moved fractionally closer in response, the way a shadow moves. The frameworks. Who has them? Seongmin considered whether to answer. Imani could see him weighing it. The particular calculation of a man deciding how much to reveal now that the outcome he'd planned was already in motion, and revelation had become, in his estimation, costless. The Busan Group has expressed considerable interest in your Port District routes, he said. The Lim family, as of this afternoon, has redirected their partnership investment, and certain documentation regarding your transition to legitimate operations has been shared with the compliance office in a way that will make that transition considerably more complicated. He folded his hands. By the time the sun comes up, Taejun, there will be nothing left to save. Three things happened in rapid succession. The first was that Min-jae, who had been standing near the east wall saying nothing, suddenly crossed the room toward Seong-min with an expression on his face that was no longer apologetic. It was something more complicated. The face of a young man who had agreed to something and was only now fully understanding what he'd agreed to. You said no one would get hurt, Min-jae said. He said it low, directed at Seong-min, and the words came out with a kind of pressure behind them that suggested they'd been building for a while. You said it was just about the business, the documentation. You said the men outside were just for Min-jae. Seong-min's voice was a closed door. You said no one would get hurt, Min-jae said again, louder, and the repetition was terrible in its own way, the way a person repeats something when they're trying to make it true through sheer insistence. Shut up, Seong-min said. There are women in this house. There are... Min-jae turned to Taejun, and the expression on his face was the most honest thing Imani had seen from any member of this family all evening. It was the expression of a man who had made a catastrophic error and was standing in the wreckage of it. I didn't know they were bringing guns. I thought it was just documentation, legal pressure. I thought, you thought what you needed to think, Seong-min said, to agree to what I needed you to agree to. That's how it works. You know that. Min-jae looked at his cousin. Taejun, how much did you give him? Taejun asked. His voice was entirely flat. What access? What specifically? Min-jae closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked like something had gone out behind them. The secondary server codes. The ones you use for internal communications. And a pause that cost him. The layout of the estate security system. The camera positions. The guard rotation schedule. Doyun made a sound, short, controlled. The sound a professional makes when they've just understood the full scope of a problem. The west perimeter, Doyun said to Taejun, urgently now. They knew exactly where the gaps were, the camera blind spots. That's how they got through the outer gate without triggering the primary alarm. How many came through? Taejun asked. The count I have is 8. Could be more. Doyun pressed his radio again. 2 of my men are unaccounted for on the north side. Something moved through Imani that was past fear and into something more functional. The part of her brain that had gotten her through graduate school, through 12 years of construction sites where men twice her age with half her competence had tried to talk over her, through 2 years in a house that wanted her gone. The problem-solving part. The part that looked at a difficult situation and started looking for the load-bearing elements. She thought about the estate layout. She had learned it the way she learned all her buildings. Not just the visible surfaces, but the systems underneath. The HVAC routing, the electrical infrastructure, the original service tunnels that predated the renovation by 40 years and had been sealed rather than removed because removal would have required excavating the foundation. She had documented them in her restoration survey. She had noted their access points. The kitchen. The access panel behind the cold storage unit in the kitchen connected to a service tunnel that ran beneath the east wing and emerged in the garden structure 40 meters outside the main house. It was sealed. She knew where the seal was, and she knew it was a single bolt lock, the kind that had been there since the 1970s and had never been upgraded because the tunnel had been classified as structurally defunct in the renovation permit. It was not structurally defunct. She had checked the supports herself. "There's a way out," she said. Taejun looked at her. "Not for us," she said. "For the guests. For the staff." She held his eyes. "There's a service tunnel under the kitchen. It comes out in the east garden, outside the wall they breached. If we can get people into the kitchen—" "How wide?" Do-yoon asked immediately. "One person at a time, but it's clear. I checked the supports 8 months ago." She looked at Do-yoon. 12, 15 minutes to get everyone through if they move fast. Do-yoon looked at Taejun. Taejun looked at his wife. "You measured the supports," he said. "I measure everything," she said. "It's what I do." For the first time since he'd walked back through the estate gates soaking wet with a cut above his eye and a family conspiracy unraveling around him, something shifted in Taejun's face. It wasn't relief, it was recognition. The look of a man seeing something clearly that he'd been seeing only partially for a long time. "Do-yoon," he said, "get the guests and staff into the kitchen, quietly. Imani leads them out." "I need to get to the control room first," Imani said. "If I can restore the internal security feed—" "The control room is on the second floor," Do-yoon said. "The staircase is exposed." "There's a secondary access panel in the east corridor utility room," Imani said, "behind the electrical board. It's not on any of the renovation documents because I added it during the wiring upgrade as a redundancy. No one in this house knows about it except me and the contractor, who is currently in Busan." Another silence. Shorter this time. Do-yoon said quietly, "She's the most useful person in this room." Taejun almost smiled. It was the shadow of a smile there and gone in under a second. "I know." Seongmin had been watching this exchange with an expression that had moved incrementally from confidence to something less comfortable. Not fear. Seongmin was not a man who frightened easily, but the particular discomfort of a person whose plan is encountering variables it did not account for. "It doesn't matter," he said, "even if you get everyone out of the house, even if you restore the security feed. The documentation is already transferred. The accounts have been flagged. By morning," Taejun said, "you'll be explaining to every law enforcement contact I have in 3 countries how your face ended up on security footage breaching a private residence with armed men." He crossed the room toward his uncle and stopped 2 feet from him, close enough that Seongmin had to choose between holding his ground or stepping back. He held it. "The Busan Group doesn't protect people who get caught, Uncle. You know that better than anyone." Seongmin's jaw tightened, the first crack. "And the documentation," Taejun continued. "The transit frameworks, the port district plans." He paused. "Those files were the first version, the working draft. The actual frameworks, the completed legally registered version, were filed with my compliance attorney 4 months ago. Everything you handed to the Busan Group is incomplete, outdated, useless without the registered version, which is in a secured filing system that requires biometric authorization." He looked at his uncle without blinking. "Mine." The silence that followed was the longest one of the evening. Seongmin's face went through several things in rapid succession. Imani watched them move across it, the calculation, the doubt, the rapid backward review of everything he believed he'd secured, checking it against this new information like a man running his hands along a wall he'd believed was solid and finding it hollow. "You're lying," Seongmin said. But the conviction in it was gone. "Ask the Busan Group," Taejun said. "Call them right now. Ask them what they actually have." He stepped back. "Oh, I have your phone." From outside, closer now, much closer, the sound of boots on wet stone. Do-yoon said, "Taejun, we have to move." "Take him," Taejun said, and the two remaining guards moved to Seongmin with practiced efficiency. Seongmin didn't resist. He stood very still and let them take his arms, and Imani thought that was almost more frightening than if he'd fought, the stillness of a man who believed he still had cards to play. Min-jae hadn't moved from his position near the east wall. He was standing with his arms at his sides, and his face had the quality of a man who has walked into a room and found it on fire and cannot determine which direction leads to air. Min-jae, Taejun said. His cousin looked at him. You're going to tell Do-yoon everything. Every name, every communication, every piece of access you gave them, and when. His voice was level. All of it. Tonight. Min-jae nodded. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, the nod of a man who has run out of alternatives. Hyesuk had not spoken in several minutes. She stood near the far end of the table in the red-washed light, and she was looking at her son with an expression that Imani could not read and did not try to. There were things in this family that were between a mother and her son, and had nothing to do with Imani, and this, whatever it was passing between Taejun and Hyesuk in the red emergency light with gunfire moving closer across the courtyard, was one of them. Taejun looked at his mother. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed something small, set it on the dining table between them. The family signet ring, gold, heavy, the Kong crest worn smooth from decades of use. His father's ring, then his. He didn't say anything. He just left it there. Hyesuk looked at it, and something happened in her face that was not composure and was not its opposite. It was something that lived between those two things in the country of consequences. Move, Taejun said to Do-yoon, and they were moving. The kitchen doors swung open, and Imani led the way through, because she knew the layout, because she had measured every wall and documented every system and spent 2 years learning this house in the absence of any other way to feel at home in it. And now that knowledge was the only thing standing between a house full of people and whatever Seongmin's men were carrying across the rain-soaked courtyard. The kitchen was cold and fluorescent lit on the emergency power. A different quality of light than the red dining room, harsh and functional, the kind of light that doesn't permit pretense. The dish she'd made was still on the counter where she'd left it, the spoon beside it. She passed them without looking. She went straight to the cold storage unit and said to Do-yoon, "Help me move this." The unit was heavy. Do-yoon put his shoulder into it and they shifted it 3 feet to the left, and behind it, in the wall, was an access panel painted the same institutional cream as the surrounding concrete. Seamless, unremarkable, the kind of thing that disappeared completely if you weren't looking for it. She pulled it open. Beyond it was darkness, and the smell of old concrete and earth, and something that had been sealed and undisturbed for years. A tunnel, 60 centimeters wide, low-ceilinged, running east beneath the foundations. Do-yoon shone his flashlight into it. The beam reached about 15 meters before the curve of the tunnel swallowed it. "How far?" he asked. "About 40 meters to the exit point," Imani said. "The far end opens into the garden structure. There's a metal grate. It's rusted, but it'll push out. I tested it during the survey." "You tested it," Do-yoon said. "I test everything I'm going to rely on," she said. She looked at him directly. "Get the guests through. I'm going to the control room." "I'm coming with you," Taejun said. "You need to be here. You need to hold whatever is coming through that west corridor long enough for everyone to get clear." She held his eyes. "You know I'm right." He looked at her for a long moment. The cut above his eye had dried to a dark line. His jacket was still damp from the rain. He looked, for one brief instant, not like a feared crime boss or a man in the process of dismantling and rebuilding an empire, but like a person who is very tired and very certain of one thing in the middle of everything else being uncertain. "The utility room," he said. "Lock it behind you. Don't open it for anyone whose voice you don't know." "I know your voice," she said. "Yes," he said. "You do." She was 3 steps toward the kitchen's side door when Do-yoon's radio crackled and the voice on the other end said something short and clipped that made Do-yoon's face change entirely. He turned to Taejun. "They're not just at the west perimeter." Taejun went still. "They've split," Do-yoon said. "Half went west. The other half—" He pressed the radio harder against his ear, as though proximity would change what he was hearing. "They're coming through the east garden." The east garden. Where the tunnel emerged. where in approximately 90 seconds, Do-yoon was going to start sending a line of frightened civilians through a 40-meter passage into the hands of armed men who were already waiting on the other side. Imani stopped walking. She turned around slowly, and in the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen where this family had tried to erase her, she looked at the man she had married and the man who protected him, and she understood that every plan they had just made was already broken, and that whatever came next was going to require something none of them had prepared for. They knew about the tunnel, she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Someone told them about the tunnel. She looked at the access panel standing open in the kitchen wall, the darkness beyond it, the 40 meters of enclosed concrete that led directly to armed men who should not have known it existed, whose existence was documented in exactly one survey report, filed in exactly one location, in an office that had been accessed, according to Mrs. Bay, repeatedly and without authorization over the past 18 months. She felt something go cold in the center of her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the specific weight of understanding something too late. "How many people have seen my architectural survey of this estate?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. "How many people?" she said again, and her voice had an edge in it now that she hadn't planned for and couldn't take back. "Have had access to my professional files from this property?" Do-yoon looked at Tae-jun. Tae-jun looked at the open panel in the wall. "We need another way out," he said. "Right now." And Imani, standing in the kitchen where they had tried to make her invisible, closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds and made herself think. 2 seconds. She'd closed her eyes for 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, Imani Caldwell Kang stripped everything she thought she knew about the next 10 minutes and rebuilt it from the foundation up. The tunnel was compromised. The west perimeter was breached. The east garden had men in it who should not have known the garden existed as an exit point, which meant someone had handed them a blueprint, and the blueprint could only have come from her survey files, which meant the security of this house had been sold down to its bones. She opened her eyes. "The second floor," she said. "The utility corridor that runs above the kitchen. There's a maintenance walkway that connects to the north roof access. The roof overhangs the wall by about 1.5 meters on the north side, the side they haven't breached. It's 40 feet to the ground on the north side," Do-yoon said. "There's a drainage pipe, cast iron, bolted into the stone. I flagged it for replacement in the restoration report because it's original infrastructure and it's old, but old cast iron doesn't fail fast, it fails slow." She looked at him. "It'll hold, if people go one at a time and move fast." Do-yoon looked at Tae-jun. Tae-jun didn't look back at him. He was already looking at the ceiling, tracing the layout in his head the way Imani had traced it, working out angles and distances and the movement of men through a structure under pressure. She recognized the look. She'd seen it on construction foremen who were good at their jobs. The look of spatial intelligence working fast. "How do we get to the second floor without crossing the main corridor?" he asked. "The dumbwaiter shaft," she said. "Kitchen to second floor. It's wide enough for a person." Do-yoon blinked. "You're sure?" "I measured it," she said. For the third time tonight that phrase, "I measured it," was doing the work of a much longer explanation, and every time it landed she could see the same recalibration happening in the men around her, the adjustment of an assumption they hadn't known they were carrying. Tae-jun moved to the far kitchen wall and opened the dumbwaiter panel without being told which one it was. She had pointed it out to him once, 8 months ago, during a conversation about the renovation timeline that he'd half attended while reading messages on his phone. She'd noted at the time that he retained more than he appeared to. Now she was certain of it. "Do-yoon," he said, "get everyone to the second floor. Imani goes first. She leads them to the roof access. You take the rear." He looked at the 2 guards still with them. "Park, you're with Do-yoon. Choi, you're with me." "Where are you going?" Imani said. "Songmin," he said. "He's still in the dining room with 2 guards on him, and if his men get inside the house before we have everyone clear, then come with us," she said. "Leave Seongmin. He's not worth—" "He'll give them the codes to the safe room," Tae-jun said. "The documentation that's still physical. The registered copies of the partnership transfers, the original identity files for every operation we've been winding down. If they get those, it doesn't matter what my compliance attorney filed. They'll have enough to bury us regardless." He held her eyes. "I have to get there first." She knew he was right. She hated that she knew it. "Don't be slow," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Something better than a smile. The expression of a man who is afraid for the person in front of him and is also, underneath the fear, certain of her. Never. He went through the kitchen door with Choi a step behind him, and Amani turned to the dumbwaiter shaft and did not watch him go because if she watched him go, she would lose the 2 seconds she needed to stay functional. "Who's first?" she said to Do-yoon. He gestured to the elderly woman in the blue dress, the woman who'd been under the table. She was standing now, supported by one of the younger guests, a man in his 30s who had the dazed, compliant expression of someone in mild shock. He was being more useful than he knew. Shock, in Amani's experience, sometimes produced a quality of calm cooperation that panic never could. "Can you climb?" Amani asked the elderly woman. The woman straightened her spine. "I climbed mountains before you were born." "Good," Amani said. "Go straight up, push the hatch at the top, step left when you get through. Wait for the next person. Don't move further until I'm up there." She helped the woman into the shaft. The woman was small, and the shaft was narrow, and there was one terrible moment when her shoe caught on the interior bracket, and Amani pressed her palm flat against the woman's foot and pushed, and the shoe came free, and the woman kept moving upward, hand over hand, with a determination that was either courage or the suspension of full comprehension, and either way, it was enough. One by one, they went up. Amani counted them in her head, the man in shock, then 2 women who were quieter than the situation seemed to warrant, which meant they were either experienced at this or completely dissociated. Then one of the male guests who was too wide in the shoulders and had to be turned sideways and talked through it in a low, urgent voice by Do-yoon, who had the particular talent of making calm sound like a reasonable option even when it wasn't. Outside, the gunfire had moved. That was the thing Amani tracked with half her attention, while the other half managed the evacuation. The acoustic signature of the shooting had shifted from the west courtyard toward the side of the house, which meant the men outside were closing in, and the window of time before someone came through, a ground floor door was compressing. She went up the shaft last, before Do-yoon, because she was the one who knew where they were going. The second-floor maintenance corridor was unlit. The emergency power hadn't reached the secondary systems up here, or had been cut selectively, and the darkness was the dense, directionless kind that turns spatial memory into the most important thing you have. Imani moved through it with her hand trailing the right-hand wall because she had walked this corridor in daylight a dozen times, and she knew that the wall curved left after 14 paces. And then there was a door with a push-bar handle, and beyond it, the rooftop access stairs. She counted paces. 14. The wall curved. The door was there. She pushed through, and cold air hit her. Rain-soaked, sharp, the particular cold of a Seoul night in the wet season. And they were on the rooftop access landing, a narrow concrete platform with a metal stair railing, and above them the final flight to the actual roof. "Move," she said quietly, and the guests moved. The roof was flat on the maintenance section and sloped on the decorative section, and the slope was their problem. The drainage pipe was on the decorative section, on the north face, and getting to it meant crossing 20 feet of 45-degree Korean tile in the rain in the dark and dress shoes. The first guest to try it, the man who'd been in shock, who had apparently come out of it somewhere between the dumbwaiter and the cold air, went sideways on the third step, and Amani grabbed his wrist with both hands, and her own feet shot out from under her, and for approximately 1 second both of them were entirely subject to gravity and rain and the complete indifference of the universe. Her left knee hit the tile ridge. Hard. Pain shot up her leg in a bright specific line, and she registered it and filed it and held the man's wrist and dug the toe of her shoe into the grouting between tiles and did not let go. They stopped sliding. "I've got you," she said. Her voice came out even. She had no idea how. "Put your right foot on the ridge. Feel it. Put your weight there." He found it. Steadied. "Now the next one." They crossed the roof like that, Amani moving alongside each person, one hand on the tile ridge, one hand available. Her knee screamed every time she bent it, and she bent it every 3 seconds. By the time they reached the north face, her palm was bleeding from a tile edge she hadn't seen in the dark, and she'd stopped noticing it. The drainage pipe was where she'd measured it. Old cast iron, gunmetal gray, bolted at 4-foot intervals into the estate's stone exterior. It ran from the roof to the ground in a straight, uninterrupted vertical line, and she grabbed it with both hands and pulled and felt it hold, not perfectly, not without a slight alarming flex that she felt through her palms, but it held. "One at a time," she said. "Hands here and here. Lower yourself. Don't jump. The pipe will flex. Let it. Keep your feet on the wall." The elderly woman from the dining room was looking at the pipe and then at the 40-foot drop and then back at the pipe. Her jaw was set. "The mountains you climbed," Amani said. "Did any of them have a rope?" "Some of them." "Same principle," Amani said. The woman gripped the pipe. She went down. She was slow, and every second of her descent was a second Amani spent watching the access door behind them and listening to the sounds of the house below and trying to determine from acoustics alone how much time remained. The shooting from the west side had gone quiet. That was either good or the worst possible thing, and she couldn't determine which without information she didn't have. 3 more guests descended. Then the man who'd nearly slid off the roof, who turned out, in the cold air and crisis, to be more capable than his initial shock suggested, he went over the edge quickly, almost too quickly, and made it down in under a minute. Do-yoon appeared beside her. His jacket was gone. There was a dark stain on his shirt at the shoulder that Imani registered without commenting on. "How many left?" he asked. "2 of your men and Mrs. Bay," she said. "She's still inside. I didn't see her come up through the shaft." Do-yoon's jaw tightened. He spoke into his radio, static. Then Mrs. Bay's voice, very quiet. "I'm in the east corridor. I have 2 of the kitchen staff with me. The west corridor is blocked. They're inside the house." Inside the house. "Mrs. Bay," Amani said, taking the radio. "The utility room at the end of the east corridor. There's an electrical panel on the right wall. Behind it, there's a secondary access point to the control room wiring. Do you know that room?" "Yes." "Can you get there?" A pause. Sounds that might have been movement. "Yes." "Go there, lock the door. Don't open it until I tell you." She paused. "And Mrs. Bay, thank you for everything you told me tonight." A short silence, then, "Don't let them win, ma'am." "Working on it," Imani said, and handed the radio back to Do-yoon. She looked at the access door they'd come through, then at the 2 remaining guards, who were positioned on either side of it, weapons out. "I need to get to the control room," she said to Do-yoon. "The control room is on this floor," he said. "East wing." "I know where it is. I need to get there without going through the main corridor." She thought. "The maintenance walkway connects to the east wing utility room. If I can get through before they reach that section..." "Imani!" Do-yoon's voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not warmth, exactly. Respect, direct and unornamented. "What's in the control room that's worth the risk?" "The security feed. If I can restore it and seal the west wing, there's a fire door system. It's on the secondary power circuit, which is still running. I can isolate them on that side of the house. And the intercom. Seongmin's confession. He made it in the dining room, and the estate recording system runs on a separate circuit from the main power. Everything he said tonight is on that system." She held Do-yoon's eyes. "If I can pull that recording and transmit it through the estate's external communication line to Tae-jun's legal contacts, it's over. Not just tonight. All of it. Everything Seongmin built with the Busan Group. Every arrangement. Every name he dropped in that room. All of it on record." Do-yoon looked at her for a long moment. 2 minutes, he said. "I'll get you to the utility room door. After that, you're on your own until Tae-jun reaches you." 2 minutes, she said. They went back through the access door into the maintenance corridor, and this time Do-yoon was in front with his weapon out, and Imani was behind him with her bleeding hand pressed flat against her side, and her knee sending pain signals she continued to file and ignore, and they moved through the darkness with the particular economy of 2 people who have stopped wasting anything. The maintenance walkway was narrow and ran above a drop ceiling. She could hear the estate below her through the acoustic tile, sounds moving through the house, boots on marble, voices saying short operational things to each other in tones that confirmed they were trained, and they were not here by accident, and they had a plan that someone had put significant resources into. Seongmin had not built this in a week. This had been months, maybe longer. The thought moved through her without permission, and she let it move through and kept walking. Do-yoon stopped at a junction, held up one fist. She stopped. Below them, through the ceiling tile, voices. 2 men. Close. They waited. Imani breathed through her nose, slow and even, and counted the seconds by the pulse in her knee, and at 17 seconds the voices moved away down a corridor, and Doyun's fist opened, and they moved again. The utility room door was at the end of the walkway. Doyun tried the handle. It opened. Unlocked, because it had been accessed recently, because Mrs. Bay had been here. The room was small and smelled of electrical work, warm metal and rubber insulation, and on the right wall was the panel exactly where Imani had told Mrs. Bay it would be. Doyun stopped at the doorway. "I have to go back for my men." "Go," she said. "Tae-jun, I'll be in the control room." She was already moving toward the panel. "Tell him I'll leave the door unlocked." Doyun left. The door didn't close all the way behind him, and she didn't go back to close it because she needed both hands on the panel housing, and the catch was on the left side, behind the conduit bracket, and she had to work it blind by feel because she wasn't going to use her phone light in a room with a gap under the door. The panel swung open. Behind it was a secondary access hatch, 18 inches square, just large enough, leading to the crawl space behind the control room's rear wall. She'd had it installed without noting it in the primary renovation documents as a redundancy access point for the building management systems, the kind of thing that made project managers nervous and good architects insistent. Every system needed a way in from the back. Everything needed a secondary approach. She went through on her hands and her knee sent a protest through her entire body that was significant enough that she stopped for half a second with her forehead against the crawl space floor and just breathed. Then she kept moving. The control room hatch was on the other side of a 6-foot crawl. She counted them on her palms. The hatch opened inward. She remembered that, had confirmed it the one time she'd used this access point for an actual wiring inspection. And she pushed it, and it opened, and she climbed through into the control room. The room was small and climate-controlled. Banks of monitors along one wall, currently dark on the main feeds, but with secondary indicators still running. The fire suppression system status board. The door lock indicators, the intercom routing panel. On the far wall, a server rack with a recording status light that was green. Green. It had been recording all night. Imani sat down in the operator's chair, and for approximately 3 seconds, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the evening. The kitchen, the cold plate, the crawl space, the roof, her knee, her bleeding hand, and then she opened the recording system interface and started working. The recording was there. All of it. The dining room audio from the moment Tae-jun walked back in, the quality was institutional, but clear. The kind of clear that holds up in a legal proceeding because the system was installed to a corporate security standard and the microphones were positioned by someone who understood acoustics. She found the segment she needed. Seong-min's voice, unhurried and assured, describing the transfer of documentation, the arrangement with the Busan Group, the plan to destroy Tae-jun's marriage and destabilize his authority. Min Jae's voice, confirming the access codes and the security layout, the specific names, the specific transfers, all of it. She opened the external communication routing, found Tae-jun's legal contact, filed in the estate system under an alias she'd set up 18 months ago during a conversation with his compliance attorney that Tae-jun knew about and Seong-min had apparently not found, and started the transmission. The progress bar moved, 60%, 70%. Then the control room door handle moved, slowly, the way a handle moves when the person on the other side of it is trying not to make noise. Imani's hand went to the fire suppression system panel, the secondary circuit. She'd looked at it the moment she sat down. Old habit, the habit of a woman who identified exits and failsafes in every room she entered. And she knew what it did, and she knew the coverage zone, and she knew that activating it would fill the corridor outside this room with a dense white chemical fog that would reduce visibility to approximately 0 in under 4 seconds. The handle completed its rotation. The door began to open. 80%. Imani put her finger on the suppression control and watched the door and watched the progress bar, and the door came open, and in the doorway, backlit by the red emergency wash of the corridor, stood Seong-min, not restrained, not flanked by guards, alone. Which meant the 2 guards Tae-jun had left on him were no longer a factor, and the specific implications of that were something she could not afford to follow to their conclusion right now. He looked at her across the control room, at the monitor, at the progress bar on the screen, 87%. "Stop it," he said. His voice had changed. The performance was entirely gone. What was underneath was the voice of a man who had spent 30 years building something and was watching it come apart in real time and had arrived through that process at a place beyond strategy and into something more primitive. "Stop it, or I will stop it for you." He took one step into the room. Amani kept her finger on the suppression control and her eyes on the progress bar, and she said, "You should know that this system requires a manual override to interrupt a transmission in progress. The override is on the server rack behind you. By the time you reach it, 93%. He crossed the room fast, faster than she expected from a man his age and build, the fast of someone running on something beyond physical capacity. And he grabbed her wrist, the one connected to the hand on the suppression control, and pulled. And she let him pull it because her other hand was already on the secondary control she'd identified the moment she sat down. The fire suppression system activated throughout the entire West Wing. White vapor exploded into every corridor on the west side of the estate simultaneously. The design of the system was zone-based, and she had selected all west zones in the 3 seconds, while Seong-min was crossing the room. And through the control room's internal speaker, she could hear it, the hiss and the immediate disorientation of men in corridors who suddenly could not see their hands in front of their faces. Seong-min's grip on her wrist tightened. He reached past her for the monitor, for the keyboard, for anything that would stop the transmission, and she pushed back against his weight with everything she had, which was not as much as he had in terms of raw mass, but was applied with the focused precision of a woman who had identified every leverage point in the room before he entered it. 98%. He got a hand on the keyboard. She drove her elbow back into his ribs. Not a trained strike, not a practiced movement, just the application of a sharp bone to a soft area with as much force as she could generate from a seated position. And he exhaled hard, and his grip on the keyboard slipped. 99%. He recovered. He was going to reach the keyboard. She could see it. The math of it was simple, and she was not going to be able to stop him with her body, because her body was not the right tool for this. She pushed back from the desk with both feet, and the chair rolled, and she and Seong-min went backward together and hit the server rack behind them, and the rack shuddered, and one of the status lights went red, and the contact Seong-min needed to sever to stop the transmission was in the server rack, and she had just put his body between herself and it. The screen read, "Transmission complete." Seong-min went absolutely still. The white vapor from the suppression system had reached the gap under the control room door and was beginning to seep through, thin tendrils of it moving across the floor like something alive. Through the door, the sounds of the West Wing had changed. The organized movement of trained men had become something less organized. Voices calling to each other with the particular urgency of people who can't see. Seong-min released her wrist. He stepped back. He was breathing hard. She could hear it, could feel the heat of it in the small room. And he looked at the screen that said "Transmission complete," and his face went through something she did not have a name for. "You don't know what you've done," he said. "I know exactly what I've done," she said. She was also breathing hard. Her wrist was going to bruise. Her knee was a sustained and dedicated source of information she continued to decline to fully process. "I recorded and transmitted a full confession to 3 separate legal contacts, along with documentation of an armed breach of a private residence. By the time anyone in this family is drinking coffee tomorrow morning, every name you mentioned in that dining room is going to be known to people whose job it is to follow up on names." Seong-min looked at her. "This family," he said, "you don't belong to it." "You keep saying that," she said, "and yet here I am, in the control room of this house, having just done the thing that determines what happens to everyone in it." She held his eyes across the dispersing vapor. "Tell me again where I don't belong." The control room door came open behind him. Taejun stood in the doorway with Choi a step behind him and Do-yoon beyond that, and he was breathing hard, and there was a new cut on his hand, and his jacket was gone. And he looked across the room at Imani first, before anything else, the way a person looks at the one thing they need to confirm is intact before they can process the rest of the information in the room. She lifted her chin. Slightly. "Enough." His eyes moved to Seong-min. Seong-min turned to face his nephew. He was 63 years old, and he had built and burned and schemed for 30 years, and he was standing in chemical vapor with his chest heaving and everything he'd planned in ruins around him, and there was, in the set of his jaw, not defeat exactly, but something that had accepted defeat while refusing to name it. "It's over," Taejun said. "Is it?" Seongmin said. Outside, from the west wing, beyond the sealed fire doors, beyond the white vapor filling the corridors, a sound rose. Not gunfire. Something else. The sound of men encountering something they hadn't planned for, and then, cutting through it, clear and unmistakable, the rising note of police sirens moving fast through the rain toward the estate walls. Taejun looked at Amani. "The transmission," she said. "I included the estate's GPS coordinates and a live breach notification to the law enforcement contact in your legal file, the one registered under the compliance attorney." She paused. "Did you know that's been in your system for 18 months? He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I didn't." "I put it there," she said, 8 months ago. After the files went missing. I didn't know exactly what it was for yet. I just knew I wanted a way to call for help that no one in this house could intercept." Her voice was steady. Her hands had stopped shaking about 90 seconds ago and had not started again. "Turns out I was right to want one." In the corridor, Do-yun was already on his radio. The sounds from the West Wing had reorganized into the specific acoustic pattern of men surrendering, calls going out, the clatter of weapons on marble, voices responding to commands in the tones people use when the decision has already been made. Seongmin stood in the middle of the control room with the vapor clearing around his feet and the sirens getting louder, and his nephew in the doorway. And he looked, for the first and only time that evening, like what he actually was. An old man who had made a choice a long time ago and had spent 3 decades running toward its conclusion and had finally arrived. "Your father," he said to Taejun, "he would have done the same thing I did." "My father," Taejun said, "is not here." He looked at Choi, and Choi moved forward and took Seongmin by the arm, and Seongmin went without resistance, and the door to the East Wing corridor opened to admit the sound of the estate coming back under control, voices organizing, the distant authoritative cadence of law enforcement moving through a breach scene, the specific quality of a crisis reaching its end. Taejun crossed the room to Imani. He stopped in front of her and looked at her wrist. She hadn't noticed she was holding it, and then at her knee, which was apparently more visible in its damage than she'd realized, and then at her face. And the thing on his face was the thing she'd seen in the dining room when he'd looked at her across the length of the table, but larger now, more unguarded, the version of it that only appeared when no one was watching. "The control room," he said. "Someone had to get here," she said. "You're bleeding." "I know." "Your knee?" "I know." She looked up at him. Her voice, which had held steady through everything, through the kitchen and the roof and the crawl space and Seongmin's hand on her wrist, developed for the first time all evening a small fracture in it. "I'm fine. I'm going to need about 40 minutes and somewhere to sit that isn't a crawl space, but I'm fine." Taejun put both hands on her face, gently, the way you hold something that has survived being put through something it should not have had to go through. "I heard you," he said. "In the kitchen, when Mrs. Bay told you everything. I was in the doorway and I heard all of it." His voice was low. "Every month I didn't see it. Every time We're not doing that right now," she said. "There are police coming through the gate, and Seongmin needs to be processed, and Do-yoon's shoulder needs attention, and Mrs. Bay is still in that utility room with 2 kitchen staff members, and someone needs to tell her it's safe to come out." She looked at him. "We can do the other thing later. We have time for the other thing later." He nodded. Once. The nod of a man accepting a postponement, not because he doesn't feel the weight of what's being postponed, but because he trusts that the postponement is temporary. He dropped his hands from her face and turned to the door. Then he stopped. He turned back. "The transmission," he said. "You said you sent it to 3 contacts." "Yes." "My legal contact, Do-yoon's emergency line." He looked at her. "Who was the 3rd? Imani looked at him steadily. "A journalist," she said. "Investigative, based in Seoul. She's been covering the Busan group for 2 years." A pause. "I found her work about 14 months ago. I've been sitting on her contact information ever since. Tonight seemed like the right time. The sirens were at the gate now. Red and blue light was beginning to move across the control room's small high window, the rotating pulse of it washing over everything in the room, over the monitoring bank and the server rack and the transmission complete still glowing on the screen. Tae-jun looked at his wife across the small room with the vapor still dispersing around their feet and the police at the gates and everything they'd built together either saved or destroyed. They wouldn't know which for days, possibly weeks, possibly months. And his expression was something she wanted to hold on to because it was the truest thing she'd seen on any human face in a very long time. A journalist, he said. A journalist, she confirmed. You've been planning this for 14 months. I've been prepared, she said. There's a difference. Outside, a voice on a megaphone was ordering everyone in the estate to remain where they were. The gate was open. The night was moving into its final phase, the phase where the structures that had been broken would begin to be accounted for, and the ones that had held would start to become visible. Tae-jun Kong looked at the woman he had married, and he said simply, and without any of the elaborate distance that had marked this family's way of speaking about everything that mattered, "I'm sorry it took me this long." And Amani said nothing back, because some things don't need an answer, and because the sirens were loud and there was work still to do, and because the look she gave him in return carried everything she hadn't said across 2 years of silence. And he read it. She watched him read it, with the full attention of a man who has finally decided to stop being slow about the things that matter most. The control room door opened. Do-yoon said, "Police are requesting the primary account holder at the front entrance." Tae-jun straightened his jacket, looked at Amani once more. "Can you walk?" She stood, putting her weight on both feet, letting the knee register its complaint, and then overruling it. "Yes." "Then walk with me," he said. And she did. The rain had not stopped. It was still coming down when the first police vehicle cleared the estate gate, and it was still coming down 2 hours later when the last of Seong-min's men was walked out in restraints past the flower beds that had been knocked sideways during the breach, past the courtyard stones that were dark with rain, and in 2 places with something darker than rain. It fell on the estate the way it falls on everything that has just been through something, without commentary, without mercy, without any particular interest in what had happened beneath it. Amani stood at the front entrance and watched them process the scene and let the cold of it reach her because cold, right now, was clarifying. A police medic had looked at her knee in the East Corridor hallway. Not the grand entrance, not a room she'd chosen, just the first flat surface that had presented itself when the immediate urgency drained out of the evening and her body began to submit its full accounting of the night's costs. The medic was young and professional and told her in careful English that nothing was broken, which she had already suspected, and that she should stay off it for a week, which she had already decided was not going to be possible. He wrapped it with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this in worse conditions and moved on. Her wrist he wrapped too. The bruising from Seong-min's grip was already developing, a band of dark color around the bone that would be fully visible by morning. She didn't look at it. She looked at the courtyard. Tae-jun was at the front of the estate speaking to a detective, a senior man in a gray coat who had the focused, undramatic manner of someone for whom crime scenes were a professional context rather than an event. They had been talking for 40 minutes. Tae-jun was speaking in Korean, occasionally in English, and from where Amani stood she could not hear the words, but she could read the shape of the conversation in the set of his shoulders and the controlled economy of his gestures. The conversation of a man who has decided to be entirely truthful and is finding that truth, once committed to, has a momentum of its own. Do-yoon came to stand beside her. His shoulder had been treated, the stain on his shirt covered now by a white field dressing, his jacket back on over it, the whole arrangement suggesting that Do-yoon considered visible injury a form of incomplete information management. He stood with her for a moment without speaking, which was, she had come to understand over 2 years of observing him, his version of companionship. "2 of the men from the West Wing are unaccounted for," he said finally. "Police are searching the grounds." "They'll find them," she said. "Probably." "Seong-min's contact at the Busan group," she said. "Does Tae-jun have a name?" "He has 3 names now. Min-jae gave them up in the first 10 minutes. A pause. "Min-jae is not built for what Seong-min needed him to be." Imani thought about Min-jae in the dining room, standing by the east wall with his arms at his sides, repeating, "I thought no one would get hurt," with the insistence of someone trying to make a true thing out of a false belief. She thought about what it cost a person to admit, at 29, in the middle of a disaster you helped create, that you had known what you were agreeing to and had told yourself a story about it anyway. "What happens to him?" she asked. "That depends on how cooperative he continues to be." Do-yoon was quiet for a moment. "And on Tae-jun?" "Tae-jun won't bury him," she said. "No, he won't." Do-yoon looked at her sideways. "You know him well." "I know him well enough," she said. "I'm still learning some parts." Do-yoon made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same space a laugh would have. He went back inside, and Amani stood alone at the entrance and watched the detective close his notebook and shake Tae-jun's hand, and Tae-jun walked back across the courtyard through the rain toward her. He was moving differently than he had at any point in the evening. Not the controlled stillness of crisis management, not the particular economy of a man in operational mode. Something slower. The walk of a person on the other side of something who is taking the first few steps in the new territory and finding the ground unfamiliar. He stopped beside her and looked out at the courtyard. "They're taking Seongmin to the central processing facility," he said. "Min Jae is being interviewed. They'll charge him separately. The cooperation will be a factor." He was quiet for a moment. "The Busan contacts will be picked up by morning. The detective says the journalist you contacted," a brief pause on the word, the micro-pause of a man still locating his feelings about a decision made without his knowledge that turned out to be correct, "has already been in communication with the Financial Crimes Division. They've been building a case on the Busan Group for 18 months independently. Tonight's recording fills 3 specific gaps they couldn't close." "Good," Amani said. "It also means everything becomes public," he said. "The Kang name, the history, what we were and what I've been trying to move away from, all of it gets examined." "I know." "The legitimate business takes damage. The Lim partnership. There'll be a period of uncertainty. Some of it won't survive the scrutiny." "I know," she said again. "I knew that when I sent the transmission." He looked at her. Rain was collecting on the shoulders of his jacket. He didn't appear to notice. "You decided that was the right call." "I decided that a clean accounting was the only foundation worth building on," she said. "Everything built on concealment eventually gets taken apart by it. I've spent 2 years watching that happen inside these walls. I wasn't going to let it happen to the one thing in this house that was actually worth keeping." Tae-jun was quiet for a long moment. The rain came down. Somewhere in the West Wing, a police radio crackled and someone responded to it in the flat professional cadence of routine. "The thing worth keeping," he said. "The legitimate company," she said. "The port project. The housing development. The things you've been building toward for 3 years." The pause. "And us, obviously." He looked at her, and something in his face did what it had been doing all night at intervals. The thing that was too unguarded for the Tae-jun most people knew, the thing that she had spent 2 years understanding was the truest version of him, the one that lived underneath the name and the empire and the weight of everything the Kang family had made of itself over 3 decades. "Obviously," he said very quietly. They stood together in the rain for another moment, not touching, just standing, the way 2 people stand when they have been through something large enough that proximity itself is a form of communication and nothing more is required. Then she said, "I need to find Mrs. Bay." He nodded. "I'll come with you." They went inside. The estate was a changed place. The same walls, the same floors, the same grandfather clock in the corridor marking time, with the same indifference it had marked it all evening. But the air was different. The way air is different after a storm has moved through a space and left it rearranged. Police personnel moved through the rooms with purposeful quietness. The flower arrangements in the dining room were knocked sideways. One of the tall windows had a crack in the corner from something that had struck it during the breach, a thin white line running from the upper frame diagonally toward the center, like a fault in the surface of something that had believed itself unbreakable. They found Mrs. Bay in the utility room at the end of the east corridor, exactly where Amani had left her, with 2 kitchen staff members, a young woman named Ji Yeon and an older man named Mr. Cho, seated on the floor beside the electrical panel. Mrs. Bay was standing. She had been standing, Amani suspected, for the entire time since they'd spoken on the radio, because sitting was not a thing Mrs. Bay did when she was waiting for information she didn't yet have. When the door opened, she looked first at Imani, and then at Taejun, and then at Imani again. And what moved across her face was not relief so much as the release of a sustained effort, the way a person exhales when they have been holding their breath for so long that they've stopped being aware of it. "It's done," Imani said. Mrs. Bay nodded, one precise nod. Then she turned to Ji-yeon and Mr. Cho and said something in Korean that Imani didn't need translated because its function was clear. It was the thing you say to people who have been frightened to help them understand that the frightening part is over. Taejun spoke to Mrs. Bay in Korean. The conversation was brief. At one point, Mrs. Bay shook her head. Not disagreement, something more like the deflection of credit. And Taejun said something that was clearly not accepting the deflection, and Mrs. Bay pressed her lips together and looked at the floor and then looked up and said something short that Taejun received with a nod. "What did you say to her?" Amani asked as they left the corridor. "I told her that she has worked in this house for 19 years and has been treated as furniture," Taejun said, "and that starting next month her salary reflects what she has actually been doing, which is running this household, and her title reflects the same." Amani looked at him. "She said that wasn't necessary," he added. "What did you say?" "I said it was." They walked the length of the east corridor in silence. At the end of it, where the corridor opened into the main hall, they stopped. Across the hall, through the double doors of the dining room that stood partly open, Amani could see the table. The candles long extinguished, the elaborate flower arrangements listing, the crystal still in place because no one had touched it since the evening came apart. The room looked like a photograph of a moment that had ended before it was finished. She looked at it for a long time. Taejun looked at it with her. "The wall," she said. He turned to her. "Between the dining room and the kitchen," she said. "When this is over, when everything is processed and accounted for, and the renovation can be permitted again." She kept her eyes on the dining room. "I want to take the wall out." He was quiet for a moment. "All of it?" "All of it. One room, one table, long enough for everyone." She paused. "Guests, staff, guards, whoever is in this house, all at the same table." Taejun looked at the wall in question, visible from where they stood as a section of the hallway's interior face, the wall that separated the performance space from the working space, the wall that had been used all evening as a border between who mattered and who didn't. "I'll get a structural assessment done," he said. "It's not load-bearing," she said. "I checked." Of course she had. He almost said it. He let it be implied instead, which was, she had found, one of his better qualities. The ability to recognize when a thing didn't need to be said, because the understanding between two people had moved past the point where saying it added anything. The formal accounting of what had happened that night took, in total, 11 days. Seong-min was charged on 6 counts, including criminal conspiracy, orchestration of an armed breach, extortion, and unlawful access to private financial systems. The 2 guards who had been on him when he reached the control room were found. Both had been restrained and left in a locked room off the west corridor, alive, by men following Seong-min's specific instruction not to harm anyone who wasn't actively obstructing. It was, the detective handling the case told Taejun, the only thing Seong-min had done that suggested any remaining line he declined to cross. Whether that counted for anything in a legal sense was not yet determined. Min-jae cooperated completely. He gave 7 hours of recorded testimony, named every contact, provided access codes and communication records that corroborated everything Do-yoon had already assembled. The prosecuting attorney described his cooperation as extensive. The court would determine what that was worth. Taejun visited him once, in the week after, in the holding facility where he was awaiting the determination of his status. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and neither of them told anyone what was said in it, and Amani didn't ask, because she understood that there are debts between people that don't resolve in language and require something quieter and more private than words to begin addressing. The Busan group contacts named in the recording were arrested across 3 days. 2 in Seoul, 1 in Busan, one who attempted to cross into China through a border point that had been flagged within 4 hours of the transmission. The journalist published her piece on the 5th day. Careful, documented, constructed with the precision of someone who had been building toward this story for 18 months and understood that the building had to hold. It named the group, named the methods, named the specific network of financial arrangements that had sustained them through a decade of official scrutiny. It did not name Imani directly, because Imani had, in her initial contact 14 months ago, communicated her terms, and one of her terms was that if the moment ever came, the story was about the network, not the woman who helped expose it. The journalist had agreed. Journalists who understood the difference between the source and the story were worth protecting, and Imani had protected this one accordingly. The Lim partnership survived, reduced in scope but intact in principle. 3 of Tae-jun's secondary business relationships withdrew in the first 2 weeks, which was expected and had been factored into the restructuring plan he'd been building for 3 years. 2 new contacts reached out in week 3, both in industries he'd been trying to enter, both citing the public record of the night as evidence of the kind of character they preferred to do business with. It was not a clean result. It was not going to be a clean result for some time. But it was a real one, built on a foundation that could bear examination, and that was the thing Tae-jun had been trying to build since the day he decided that his father's methods were not going to be his inheritance. Hyesuk was not charged. The letters, Mrs. Bae had produced, the correspondence authorizing surveillance of Imani, granting Seong-min access to her private office, were documented and entered into the record, but the prosecutorial determination was that her role, while material, did not meet the threshold for criminal co-conspiracy given the specific chain of action on the night of the breach. She had not known about the armed men. She had not known about the plan to seize the estate by force. She had known about the documentation theft and the surveillance, and had authorized both, and had helped Seong-min access information he used to orchestrate the rest, and she would carry that knowledge in the specific way people carry things they cannot put down and cannot speak about to anyone who doesn't already understand. Tae-jun met with her 3 weeks after the night. Not at the estate, at the smaller residence he'd arranged for her in a quieter district of the city, a clean, well-furnished place that was, in every respect except size and authority, comfortable. He went alone. He was there for 90 minutes. When he came back to the estate, he was quiet in the particular way he was quiet, when something had been resolved without being fixed, the way a wound closes without the underlying damage being undone, the closing being real and necessary and still not the same thing as healing. Imani didn't ask what was said. She asked, the next morning over coffee in the kitchen, how he was. He looked at his cup for a moment. She said she was sorry. What did you say back? I said I believed her. He looked up. I don't know if that's true yet, but I think it might become true. Eventually. Imani nodded. She looked at her own cup. That's honest. I'm trying to be, he said, more than I was. The renovation of the estate began 6 weeks later. Imani designed it herself, which she had always intended to do, and which was now, in the aftermath of everything, simply a fact rather than an aspiration requiring navigation of family politics. The firm she'd been using for the Port District project sent 3 contractors and a junior architect she'd worked with for 4 years, a young woman named Seo Yeon, who took one look at the estate layout and immediately understood what Imani was trying to do with the space and didn't require extensive explanation. The wall between the dining room and the kitchen came down on a Thursday. Imani was there for it. Not for the whole day, but for the first hour, watching the demolition crew work through what turned out to be, as she'd assessed, a non-structural partition, plaster, and lath over a steel frame, coming down cleanly without complaint. The space that opened up was larger than either room had been separately, longer than it looked from either side. The way spaces often are when you remove the barrier you've been measuring them against. She stood in the center of it when the dust settled, and she put her hand on the remaining wall, the outer wall, the real one, the one that actually held the roof, and felt the solidity of it under her palm, and thought about load-bearing elements, about the things that actually hold structures up versus the things that merely divide the space inside them. Mrs. Bae found her there. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, the former doorway, now just an opening in a partially demolished wall, and looked at the space with an expression that was difficult to read and then became, as Imani watched it, not difficult at all. It was the expression of a woman seeing something she'd been in proximity to for 19 years change into something it should have been from the beginning. "It's going to be one room," Amani said. "I can see that," Mrs. Bay said. "One table, long enough for everyone." Mrs. Bay looked at her. "How long?" "I'm still measuring," Amani said. "But long." Mrs. Bay nodded slowly. Then she said, very quietly, "I should have told you sooner what was happening when I first saw it." Amani looked at her. "Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't know if you would stay," Mrs. Bay said. "And if you weren't going to stay, telling you would only have—" She paused, finding the words carefully. "Made things more difficult. For everyone. And when you decided I was going to stay." "When I saw you carry that dish into the dining room," Mrs. Bay said, "knowing what would happen, carrying it anyway." A pause. "A woman who is planning to leave doesn't cook." Amani was quiet for a moment. The demolition crew was working in the far end of the space, and the sound of it was the specific productive sound of something being remade, and the dust was settling in the light that came through the tall windows. And it was, Amani thought, a long way from the fluorescent light of the kitchen on the night they'd tried to make her invisible in it. "I wasn't certain I was going to stay," she said. "I want to be honest about that. There were months when I wasn't certain." "I know," Mrs. Bay said. "What made me stay wasn't patience," Amani said. "I want to be clear about that too. It wasn't the virtue of endurance or any of that. It was—" She looked at the open space, the room becoming itself. "I had started something here, the port project, the legitimate framework, the architecture of a different kind of business built into the actual architecture of a building." She looked at Mrs. Bay. "I don't leave things unfinished." Mrs. Bay looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "No, I don't suppose you do." The table arrived on a Saturday morning in the 8th week of renovation. It was custom built. Amani had specified it herself, with Seo Yan doing the technical drawings. Long, pale oak, simple, without the elaborate lacquering and inlay of the old dining room furniture. It seated 22. When the delivery crew carried it through and set it in the center of the new open room, it looked exactly right in the way that things look right when the space has been designed for them from the beginning, rather than the thing being forced into a space designed for something else. Taejun walked around it twice. 22 seats, he said. 22 people in this house on a regular basis? Amani said, counting the security rotation. He looked at her. You counted the security rotation. I count everyone, she said. That's the point. He put his hand on the table, ran it along the surface the way people run their hands along new things, feeling for the reality of them, the actual grain and weight, confirming that they exist beyond being imagined. Then he looked up. Dinner tonight, he said. Everyone. All 22. The kitchen isn't fully operational yet, she said. We're still 2 weeks out on the appliance installation. We'll order in, he said. She looked at him. We'll order in, he said again, and something in his voice was lighter than anything she'd heard in it in 2 years. 22 people, big table, whatever everyone wants to eat. They ordered in. It was not elegant. Containers and chopsticks, and the particular cheerful chaos of food arriving in too many bags from 3 different restaurants, because consensus had proven impossible, and Taejun had finally said order what you want, and they had. And it was the best meal that had been eaten in that house in longer than anyone present could account for. Mrs. Bay sat at the table. Ji-yeon sat at the table. Mr. Cho, the kitchen staff member who had spent 2 hours on a utility room floor during a crisis and had, it emerged, been cooking in this estate for 11 years and had never once been invited to sit in the dining room even for a staff meal, sat at the table and ate and said almost nothing and did not need to. Do-yoon sat 3 seats from Taejun with his shoulder heeling and his jacket on and ate with the contained efficiency of a man for whom eating has always been primarily functional and who was finding, in the company of 21 other people around a table with no hierarchy enforced by seating arrangement, that it could also be something else. Amani sat near the center, not at the head, not at any position that designated anything about authority or status or the geometry of power. Just in the middle, where she could see most of the table, where the conversation from both ends reached her, where she could hear Mrs. Bay telling Ji-yeon something that made the younger woman laugh, a real laugh, not a polite one. and where she could look up and find Taejun looking at her from his own unremarkable position somewhere in the middle of the long pale oak table, just a man eating takeout at the table his wife had designed, in the room his wife had opened up, in the house his wife had saved. He didn't say anything when their eyes met. He didn't have to. He raised his glass. Water, not wine, a choice she'd noticed and not commented on because she understood what it meant. And she raised hers, and they drank and looked away and went back to the conversation around them, which was ordinary and warm and full of the particular sound of people who have been through something together and have arrived, improbably, at a place where they can eat a meal and not be afraid of what comes next. It was not a resolution in the way stories resolve. Neat, conclusive, all weight accounted for. Songmin's trial was still months away. The Lim partnership was still finding its new shape. The journalist piece had opened 3 additional investigations that would work their way through the system at the pace of institutional processes, which was slow and expensive and necessary. Min-jae was awaiting sentencing. Hye-suk was in her smaller residence with her thoughts and her letters, and the particular weight of having helped dismantle something she'd believed she was protecting, and whether she would make anything useful out of that weight remained, as most things about people remain, genuinely uncertain. None of that was finished. None of it was going to be finished for a long time. But the evening was quiet. The rain had finally stopped somewhere in the late afternoon, and through the new windows of the new open room, the Seoul night was clear for the first time in weeks, the city lights visible on the hills, the sky above them doing what skies do when weather systems pass, going still and dark and full of the specific piece of something that has expended itself and returned to neutral. After dinner, after the containers were cleared and most of the household had drifted toward their own spaces for the night, Imani stayed at the table alone. Not because she was troubled, because she wanted one moment in the room by herself, with the table and the space and the absence of the wall, just to confirm that it was real. She put both palms flat on the oak surface and looked down the length of it. 22 seats. 22 people in this house who would sit here tomorrow and the day after, not because a hierarchy had been established, and the hierarchy required certain people to be present at meals, but because the room had been made for all of them, and the table was long enough. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. She knew his walk, had known it for 3 years, could identify it in the dark at 40 feet. And then he was in the doorway, jacket off, sleeves rolled, looking at her across the empty room. "You should be off your knee," he said. "I'm sitting." "You were standing when I came in." "I'm sitting now," she said. He came into the room and sat down at the seat beside her. Not at the head of the table, not at any particular designated position, just the seat beside her, because that was where she was. And he put his elbows on the table and looked down the length of it. They sat together in the quiet room. After a while he said, "My mother called today." Imani looked at him. "She didn't say much," he said. "She asked how the renovation was going. I told her the wall was down." He was quiet for a moment. "She said she was glad." "Do you believe her?" He thought about it. Really thought about it. The way he'd been doing things since the night everything broke. With the particular attention of a man who has decided to stop moving too fast through the things that deserve to be moved through slowly. "I think she means it. I think she doesn't fully understand yet what she's saying when she says it. But I think she means it." "That's a start," Imani said. "It is," he said. "It's a small one." Small starts are still starts. He looked at her. The room was lit by the installation lighting Seo-yeon had specified. Warm, low, the kind that doesn't ask anything of the people in it. It made the new table look like it had always been there. It made the open space look like it had never been divided. "I want to ask you something," Taejun said. She waited. "When you put the legal contact in the system," he said, 18 months ago, when you set up the transmission pathway and the journalist contact and all of it," he looked at her steadily. "Did you know that you were going to need it?" She thought about how to answer that honestly, because honesty was the thing she was committed to and had always been committed to, even when it was not the comfortable thing. "I knew I was in a situation where the people around me were working against me and I didn't have access to the tools I would have needed to prove it. I knew that this family had resources I didn't have and connections I couldn't access, and I was operating in a house where my mail was being intercepted and my staff was being managed out, and my professional files were being accessed without authorization." She looked at the table. "I didn't know what form the crisis would take. I didn't know it would be guns and a power outage and a tunnel that turned out to be compromised. But I knew. A pause. I knew that if I didn't build my own infrastructure, I would have nothing to stand on when the moment came. Tejun was quiet. You build backup systems the way I build safeguards, she said, because you understand what it costs when you don't have them. You built all of it alone, he said. You were fighting your own war, she said. I didn't want to be another front. He put his hand on hers where it rested on the table. Not a dramatic gesture, just contact. The hand of a man who is trying to communicate something for which he has not found adequate language and is therefore defaulting to presence. You should have been able to tell me, he said. Yes, she said. I should have been able to, and you should have made it possible to. And we're going to have to figure out how to build a version of this. She gestured at the room, at the table, at the space where the wall had been, where that's actually how it works, not just architecturally. I know, he said. That's going to take longer than taking down a wall. I know that too. She turned her hand over under his so their palms were together, and she looked at the room they'd made, and the table that sat in it, and the dark soul night visible through the windows where the rain had been. We have time, she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a conclusion. It was the specific thing it was, a true statement about a situation that was still being built, said by a woman who had learned to measure everything she was going to rely on and had measured this and found it sound, said in a room from which the dividing wall had been permanently removed, at a table long enough for everyone who belonged. Outside, the city was doing what cities do at the end of difficult nights. Continuing. Lights on the hills, traffic below, the ordinary machinery of a place that does not stop for any one family's reckoning, that absorbs each crisis into the texture of its general motion, and keeps moving, as cities do, as people do, as the things that are built to last do when the storm has passed and the morning is still hours away, and what remains, in the quiet, is only what was always real. Amani sat at her table in her open room in the house she had saved and had not left and would not leave, and she breathed, and it was enough.